The hunter's pencil stub hovered over the scrap of bark, and Zachary Frost did the arithmetic again because the answer refused to improve. 23 pieces of split pine in the woodpile outside, each good for maybe 4 hours if he was careful with the draft. 92 hours total. 3 days and 20 hours for one man, or less than 2 full days for two. And the blizzard hammering the cabin walls sounded like it had no intention of stopping before next week. He looked across the single room at the orc woman sitting on the floor near the stove, her back against the log wall, her traveling pack beside her. She had not asked to be let in. She had knocked politely an hour ago when the wind was still only moaning instead of shrieking, and when he opened the door she had said, "I saw smoke. May I wait out the storm?" Her voice had been steady, her trader's calm and precise, and snow had already been gathering in the folds of her wool cloak. Zachary had stepped aside. Now he set the bark down and stood, joints complaining. He was 32, and had spent 15 of those years walking trap lines in country that did not care whether you lived or died. The cabin belonged to the Territorial Trust, one of a chain of shelters spaced along the northern routes for hunters and mail carriers. A stove, a bench, a row of pegs on the wall, and a wood box that was supposed to stay full. He had burned through half of it yesterday before the storm closed in because he had thought he would leave this morning. "How long do you think it will blow?" the orc woman asked. Zachary turned. She was watching him, her dark eyes calm. She had introduced herself as Olwen Harrow, a scout for her clan, heading west toward their winter grounds when the weather turned. She wore sensible clothing, wool trousers, a heavy tunic, boots that laced to the knee. Her skin was the color of new leaves in spring, her tusks small and barely visible when her mouth was closed, her black hair pulled back in a braid that hung to her shoulder blades. She looked young, maybe 20, and her ears came to neat points beneath the edge of her hood, which she had finally pushed back once the stove warmed the room. 3 days if we are lucky, Zachary said. 5 if we are not, and the wood will last 2 days for both of us if I keep the fire low. Olwen nodded slowly. Then we will be cold on the 3rd day. Yes, and there is no more wood nearby. Not that we could reach. The cut logs are a 1/4 mile down the trail, and in this wind we would be lost in 10 steps. She accepted that without protest, which surprised him. Most people argued when you told them bad news as if disputing the facts would change them. Instead she said, "Then we should eat now while we are warm and save our hunger for later." Zachary almost smiled. "That is practical." "I am a scout. Practical is my trade." He pulled his pack down from one of the pegs and dug out hard biscuit, dried venison, and a handful of wrinkled apples from a farmstead 3 days south. Olwen contributed smoked fish and a packet of oat cakes that smelled faintly of honey. They divided the food evenly without discussion and ate in silence, the stove ticking as the metal expanded, the wind howling like a living thing that wanted in. When they finished, Zachary said, "There is one blanket. I can sleep on the bench without it if you take the floor by the stove." Olwen looked at him for a long moment. "That is gallant and also stupid. You will freeze, and then I will have to drag your body outside in 3 days, which I do not want to do. We are both adults. We can share the blanket and the warmth and survive with our dignity intact. Your people will not object. My people are not here, and if they were, they would call me a fool for letting you die to preserve some human notion of propriety." She paused. "Will your people object?" "I have no people. I am a trapper. I work alone." "Then it is decided." She stood and spread the blanket on the floor near the stove, then added her cloak on top for extra insulation. "We sleep back to back. If you snore, I will kick you." Zachary found he did not have an argument against that, so he added his own coat to the pile and lay down with his back to hers. The blanket was barely wide enough. He could feel the heat of her through both their shirts, and her shoulder blades pressed against his spine. She was taller than he expected, perhaps 5.5 feet, and solid in the way someone got when they walked long distances for a living. "Your feet are cold," she said after a moment. "So are yours. Mine are farther from you, not by much." She made a noise that might have been a laugh, and then neither of them spoke again. The stove burned low, the wind screamed, and eventually Zachary slept. He woke once in the deep night to find that they had both shifted in their sleep, and he was now curled around her back, one arm slung over her waist. He started to pull away, but she muttered, "Don't. It is warmer this way," and he subsided. Her braid was against his face and smelled like pine smoke and cold air. He closed his eyes and did not let himself think about how easy it would be to stay like this. Morning came gray and furious. The wind had not slackened. Snow had drifted against the door, and when Zachary forced it open a crack, he saw nothing but white chaos. He shut it again and wedged the latch. "Still blowing," Olwen said from the floor. She had rolled the blanket and was sitting on it, braiding her hair again. Her fingers moved quickly, competent. "Yes. Then we wait." They rationed the wood carefully. Zachary fed the stove 4 pieces in the morning, let it burn down to coals, then added 3 more at midday. The temperature inside the cabin never rose above tolerable, and their breath misted when they spoke. They played word games to pass the time, each trying to stump the other with the names of plants or animals. Olwen knew a dozen terms for snow that Zachary had never heard. He taught her the lowland names for trees she had only seen from a distance. "You are educated," she said at one point. "I had a mother who believed in books." She died when I was 16. Fever." "I am sorry," Zachary shrugged. "It was a long time ago." Grief does not care about time. He looked at her, surprised by the gentleness in her voice, but she had already turned back to the scrap of wood she was carving with a small knife. He did not ask what she was making. That night they lay back to back again, the blanket pulled tight. The cold crept in as the stove died to embers. Zachary's feet ached and he tucked them up toward his chest. "Stop squirming," Olwen said. "I am not squirming, I am freezing. You are squirming and freezing. Here." She rolled over, grabbed his nearer foot and tucked it between her knees. The warmth was immediate and shocking. Zachary went still. "You don't have to do that, I know, but now you will stop squirming and I can sleep." She was quiet for a moment, then added, "You can put the other one on top if you want. I am not shy." He hesitated, then carefully slid his other foot up between her calves. The heat of her skin through his wool socks was better than the stove. He felt her relax against him, and after a while he slept again. The second day was longer than the first. They were hungrier, colder, and running out of things to say. Zachary checked the door twice, and both times found the storm unrelenting. The snow had piled halfway up the frame. Olwen sat cross-legged on the blanket and finished her carving, a small bird with outstretched wings, rendered in surprising detail. "That's beautiful," Zachary said. "It is a storm thrush. They nest in the high rocks near my clan's summer grounds." She turned it in her hands, then offered it to him. "For your hospitality." "I didn't do anything. This is a trust cabin. Anyone can use it. You let me in without question. Not every human would." Zachary took the carving, the wood still warm from her hands. Not every orc would have knocked. Olwen smiled, and he saw her tusks clearly for the first time, pale against her lower lip. "That is fair." They ate again at midday, smaller portions this time. The venison was nearly gone. Zachary calculated how much was left and felt the numbers settle like stones in his gut. If the storm lasted 4 days, they would be very hungry. If it lasted 5, they would be in trouble. That night the cold was worse. They huddled together under the blanket and both cloaks, back to front, and Zachary was acutely aware of every point where their bodies touched. She fit against him as if they had been doing this for years, her spine aligned with his chest, her head tucked under his chin. He tried not to think about it. He tried to sleep. Instead, he lay awake listening to her breathe and feeling the slow, steady beat of her heart against his forearm. Somewhere in the darkest hours, he realized he had started to care whether she was warm enough, whether she was frightened, whether she thought about him the way he was beginning to think about her. It was absurd. They had known each other for 2 days. They were strangers thrown together by weather and chance. But her hair still smelled like pine smoke, and when she shifted in her sleep, she made a small sound of contentment that lodged behind his ribs and refused to leave. He was in trouble, and it had nothing to do with the storm. The third morning dawned pale and quiet. The wind had finally stopped. Zachary pushed the door open and had to dig through a drift that reached his waist, but beyond it, the world was still and white and glittering under a thin sun. The sky was the color of old ice. "It is over," Olwen said from behind him. She stood in the doorway, squinting against the brightness. Yes, she did not sound relieved. Zachary glanced at her and saw tension in the line of her shoulders. "What is wrong?" Olwen stepped out into the snow, sinking to her knees. She looked west, toward the mountains that were now visible as white shapes against the white sky. "My people are beyond that pass. They were supposed to be in the winter camp by now, but there was a supply sled coming up from the southern trade post. 11 people with it. They should have been 3 days behind me. They would have been caught in the storm. Yes. Do you think they made it through? I do not know." She turned to him, and her face was carefully blank in the way of someone holding back fear. "I have to go look." Zachary should have nodded and wished her luck and let her go. Instead he said, "The pass will be buried. You cannot cross it alone. I have to try. You will die trying, and then you will not help anyone." He paused, thinking, "I have snowshoes and I know the mountains. If we go together, we have a chance." Olwen stared at him. "You do not owe me this, I know. It could take a week, more, I know. Why would you do this?" "Because I have spent 2 days learning the sound of your voice and the warmth of your skin, and the way you carve birds out of scraps, and the thought of you dying alone in the snow makes me feel like something is tearing open inside my chest." But he could not say that, so instead he said, "Because it is the right thing to do." Olwen looked at him for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression, something that looked almost like hope. "Then we should leave now, before the weather turns again." They gathered what little they had and set out within the hour. Zachary left a note in the cabin for the next traveler, explaining that he had taken the snowshoes and would return them when he could. He shouldered his pack, which held his traps, a coil of rope, a hatchet, and the last of the food. Olwen carried her own gear and a long staff she used to probe the snow ahead of them. The first day was hard travel. The snowshoes kept them on top of the drifts, but each step still sank 4 or 5 inches, and the effort left them both sweating despite the cold. They stopped twice to rest and drink from a creek that was still running beneath a skin of ice. Zachary cracked it with the hatchet and filled their waterskins while Olwen kept watch for movement in the trees. "You think anyone else survived the storm?" he asked. "If they found shelter, yes. If they were caught in the open." She shook her head. "The cold does not care how strong you are." They camped that night in the lee of a rocky outcrop, digging a shallow pit in the snow and lining it with pine boughs. They had no tent, so they huddled together under the blanket and cloaks again, and Zachary felt the now familiar shape of her against him. She was shivering despite her stoic silence. "Here," he said and pulled her closer, wrapping both arms around her. "You are freezing." "So are you." "Then we are both freezing together." She laughed quietly, and he felt the vibration of it against his chest. "You are a strange man, Zachary Frost. You have mentioned that before." "Have I?" "In spirit, if not in those exact words." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Thank you for coming with me. You are welcome. I mean it. I know you do not have to be here. I know you mean it." She turned her head, and her breath was warm against his neck. "I am glad you are here anyway." Zachary closed his eyes and let himself enjoy the weight of her, the heat of her, the impossible fact of her. "So am I." They slept in shifts, one watching while the other rested, and in the morning they set out again. The sun was brighter, the sky a hard blue, and the mountains rose ahead of them like a wall. Zachary led them along a ridge he knew, a game trail that followed the high ground and avoided the worst of the drifts. Olwen matched his pace without complaint, her breathing steady, her eyes always scanning the horizon. At midday they found tracks. A line of deep post holes punched through the snow, heading northeast. "Elk," Zachary said, crouching to examine them. "Big one. Broke trail an hour ago, maybe two." Olwen nodded. "Good for us. We can follow." They did, and the going became easier where the elk had packed the snow. They made good time through the afternoon, and as the light began to fail, they crested a rise and saw a frozen lake below them, a flat white expanse surrounded by spruce. And halfway across the lake, a dog. It was sitting in the snow, alone, staring at them. A big animal, maybe 80 pounds, with a thick coat and pale eyes. It did not bark. "That is a sled dog," Olwen said. Her voice was tight. Zachary nodded. "It shouldn't be out here alone." They descended carefully, watching the ice for cracks. The dog waited, utterly still, and when they got close, Zachary saw the harness still strapped to its chest, the leather chewed through where it had been tied to something. Olwen knelt in front of the dog and ran her hands over its sides, checking for injuries. "Thin," she said, "but not starving. It has been loose for a few days, maybe less. Where is the sled? That is what we need to find out." She looked up at Zachary. "Can you track backward from here?" "I can try." It took an hour of circling the lake, but eventually Zachary found more tracks, a confusion of boot prints and sled runners heading east, toward a narrow canyon that cut into the mountains. The prints were half filled with blown snow, old but not ancient. "They went that way," he said, pointing. Olwen stared into the canyon and her jaw tightened. "That is a bad place. There are slides." "Do you think they knew?" "I think they were desperate." They followed the trail into the canyon as the sun set, the walls rising steep on either side, the snow deeper here where the wind had funneled through. The dog came with them, trotting ahead as if it knew where it was going. Zachary watched it and felt a cold weight settle in his chest. They found the sled just as the last light faded. It was overturned in a narrow section of the canyon, half buried by snow that had clearly fallen from the cliffs above. Supplies were scattered around it: crates, sacks, a broken lantern, and drag marks leading away to the south, toward a cluster of boulders at the base of the wall. Olwen ran. Zachary followed, the dog at his heels, and when they reached the boulders they found a makeshift shelter. A canvas tarp stretched between the rocks, anchored with gear and weighted with snow. A faint glow came from beneath it. "Hello, the camp," Olwen called. There was a long silence, and then the tarp shifted and a face appeared. An older orc woman, her skin darker than Olwen's, her eyes suspicious. "Olwen," the woman said, and her voice cracked. "Is that you?" "Yes, grandmother." "It is me." The woman began to cry. There were 9 of them in the shelter, 8 orcs and 1 human teamster, huddled together in a space barely large enough to lie down. They were alive, but only just. The teamster had a broken leg, splinted with branches and wrapped in canvas. 2 of the orcs were children, both coughing. An older man had frostbite on his fingers, the skin black and dead. They had been stuck for 4 days, burning pieces of the sled to stay warm, eating snow and the last of their rations. Olwen moved among them, speaking softly, checking injuries. Zachary crouched beside the teamster, a lean man in his 40s with a graying beard. "What happened?" Zachary asked. "Avalanche," the man said through gritted teeth. "Small one, but it hit the sled and spooked the dogs. They scattered. We managed to catch one, but it chewed through the line and ran." He paused. "You brought it back. It found us. Figures." The man tried to smile. "I am Garrett. Thank you for coming." "Do not thank me yet. We still have to get you out of here. Can you?" Zachary looked around the shelter, at the thin faces and the shivering bodies and the terrible, fragile hope in their eyes. "Yes," he said, and prayed it was not a lie. They stayed the night because moving in the dark was suicide. Zachary gave the group half of his remaining food and built up the fire with wood he scavenged from the wrecked sled. Olwen's grandmother, whose name was Mara, sat beside him and watched with sharp eyes. "You are the hunter who let Olwen into the cabin," Mara said. "Yes," she told me. "When?" "Just now, while you were talking to Garrett." Mara paused. "She said you did not have to come with her, that you chose to." Zachary fed another piece of wood to the fire. "That is true." "Why?" "Because she would have come alone and she would have died." "That is not an answer." Zachary looked at the old woman and saw the steel in her gaze. "I came because I wanted to help. You are human. We are orcs. Most humans would have let us die." "I am not most humans." Mara studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "No, I do not think you are." She leaned closer and her voice dropped. "My granddaughter likes you. I can see it in the way she looks at you. Do you like her?" Zachary felt his face heat despite the cold. "That is between her and me, so you do." Mara smiled, and it was a predator's smile, all teeth. "Good. She deserves someone who is not a fool." Before Zachary could respond, Olwen appeared beside them, her expression unreadable. "Grandmother, stop interrogating him." "I am not interrogating. I am conversing. You are making him uncomfortable. If he is uncomfortable, he is too weak for you." Olwen sighed and took Zachary's arm, pulling him to his feet. "Come. I need your help with the supplies." They walked to the edge of the camp, out of earshot, and Olwen stopped and turned to face him. The firelight caught the green of her skin, turning it warm and golden. "I apologize for my grandmother," she said. "She is protective. She is fine. She is invasive. She cares about you. That is not a bad thing." Olwen looked at him and her expression softened. "You really do not mind?" "No." She reached out and touched his hand, her fingers cold. "Thank you for everything." Zachary folded his hand around hers without thinking. "You have already thanked me, I know, but I will probably thank you again before this is over, so you should get used to it." He smiled despite himself. "I will try." They stood there for a moment, hands clasped, and then Olwen pulled away and turned back toward the fire. Zachary watched her go and felt the place where she had touched him burning like a brand. In the morning they broke camp and began the long journey back. Zachary fashioned a sled from pieces of the wreckage, lashing them together with rope and canvas. They loaded the injured onto it. Garrett with his broken leg, one of the children who was too weak to walk, the old man with the frostbite. The others walked, leaning on staffs and each other, and Zachary and 2 of the stronger orcs pulled the sled. It was brutal work. The sled caught on every rock and root, and the weight of it dragged at Zachary's shoulders until they burned. But they moved, slow and steady, and by midday they had cleared the canyon and reached the lake. The dog ran ahead, circling back to check on them, and Zachary found himself grateful for the animal's presence. They camped that night on the lakeshore, and Zachary used his hatchet to cut firewood while Olwen tended the injuries. Garrett's leg was swelling despite the splint, and the old man's frostbite was worse. One of his fingers would have to come off, Olwen said quietly, or the rot would spread. Zachary did not ask who would do it. That night he sat with Mara again, and the old woman said, "You gave us your food. You needed it more than I did. And your traps. Olwen told me you gave those to one of the men to sell when we reached the trading post. He has children to feed. I do not." Mara nodded. "You are a fool, Zachary Frost. A kind fool, but a fool nonetheless. I have been called worse. I am sure you have." She poked the fire with a stick, sending sparks into the sky. "My granddaughter thinks you hung the moon." Zachary felt his chest tighten. "She said that?" "Not in those words. But I have known her since she was born, and I know when she has decided something. She has decided about you. We barely know each other. Some people you know in a day, some you never know in a lifetime." Mara turned her head and looked at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Which are you?" Zachary did not have an answer for that, so he stayed silent. Mara chuckled and went back to watching the flames. The next 2 days were more of the same. Hard travel, cold nights, dwindling supplies. They ran out of food on the 5th day, and Zachary left the group camped in a sheltered hollow while he went hunting. He was gone for 6 hours and returned with a winter hare, already skinned and gutted. It was not much, but Olwen made a stew that fed everyone a little, and the warmth of it was enough to keep them going. On the 7th day they found a cache, a buried stash of supplies left by trappers for emergencies. Zachary dug it out with his hands, the frozen earth tearing at his skin, and inside they found dried meat, flour, salt, and a wool blanket. He divided it evenly and told no one that the cache had been his, that he had spent a week's wages stocking it the previous autumn. Olwen found him afterward, sitting alone by the sled, and she took his bleeding hands in hers and wrapped them with strips of cloth from her own shirt. "You are giving too much," she said. "It is enough. You will have nothing left. I will have enough." She looked at him, and her eyes were bright with something he could not name. "You are the best man I have ever met. You do not know many men. I know enough." She finished tying the bandage and did not let go of his hands. "When this is over, I want to see you again." Zachary's heart stumbled. "Your people will not approve. I do not care. Your grandmother likes you. She told me so this morning. She called me a fool. She calls everyone a fool. It is a term of endearment." Olwen leaned closer and her voice dropped. "Say you want to see me again." "I do." "Then that is settled." She kissed him, quick and soft, and then stood and walked back to the others before he could respond. Zachary sat there with his bandaged hands and his racing pulse and thought that maybe, possibly, the universe was not entirely cruel. They reached the pass on the 8th day. It was buried under 15 feet of snow, impassable, and Zachary led them on a longer route that skirted the base of the mountain and added another day to the journey. The injured were failing. Garrett's fever had spiked, and the child on the sled had stopped coughing, which Olwen said was worse than the coughing itself. They needed shelter, warmth, medicine, and they needed it soon. On the 9th day they crested a ridge and saw smoke in the valley below. The Orc winter camp, a sprawl of sturdy lodges built from logs and sod, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys. Olwen shouted, her voice cracking with relief, and the others took up the cry. Figures appeared in the camp, small with distance, and then they were running up the slope to meet them. The reunion was chaotic. People were crying, embracing, shouting questions. Zachary stayed back, suddenly aware that he was the only human in a sea of orcs, and that some of them were staring at him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to hostility. Olwen appeared at his side, her hand closing around his wrist. "Stay close," she said. "Some of my people are not as understanding as my grandmother. I can leave." "You will not leave. You are my guest, and you will be treated as such." She pulled him down into the camp, and the crowd parted around them. They brought the injured to the largest lodge, where an elderly orc man with a healer's satchel took over. Zachary stood awkwardly in the corner, trying not to be in the way, until Mara appeared and thrust a bowl of hot soup into his hands. "Eat," she said. "You look like death." "I am fine." "You are not fine. You are half-starved and exhausted, and if you collapse in my granddaughter's lodge, I will be very annoyed." Zachary ate. The soup was thick with meat and vegetables, rich and savory, and it was the best thing he had tasted in days. When he finished, Mara took the bowl and handed him another. "Eat that too." "I shouldn't. You should. You gave away your food to keep my family alive. The least I can do is feed you until you stop looking like a skeleton." Zachary ate the second bowl and then a third, and by the time he was done he felt almost human again. Mara watched him with approval, then led him to a smaller lodge at the edge of the camp. "You will sleep here tonight," she said. "It is Olwen's. She will not mind." "I can't. You can, and you will. Do not argue with me, boy. I am old and I have earned the right to be obeyed." She left before he could protest further. Zachary stood in the doorway of the lodge, looking at the neat interior. A low bed piled with furs, a fire pit in the center, a rack of tools and weapons along one wall. It smelled like pine and leather and, faintly, like Olwen. He sat down on the edge of the bed and put his head in his hands. He was so tired he could barely think, and his shoulders ached from pulling the sled and his hands throbbed under the bandages. But they had made it. Everyone had survived. It was enough. He lay back on the furs and closed his eyes, and he was asleep before he could worry about whether he was supposed to be there. He woke to voices outside the lodge. Olwen's, low and angry, and a man's, sharp and aggressive. "You brought a human here." "I brought the man who saved your sister's life, yes. He is not one of us. He is my guest, and he will be treated with respect. He is a hunter. They kill for profit. How do we know he will not lead others here? Because he is not like that. You have known him for 9 days, Olwen." "You cannot. I have known him long enough." There was a pause, and then the man said, "You are sleeping with him." "That is none of your business." "It is all of our business. If you bring a human into this clan, then you will accept it because it is my choice and not yours." The man made a disgusted sound and walked away. Zachary heard his footsteps crunching through the snow, fading into the distance. Then the door of the lodge opened and Olwen stepped inside, her face flushed with anger. She saw that he was awake and stopped. "You heard?" "Yes, I apologize." "Darren is traditional. He is not wrong. I am an outsider. You are the man who risked his life for people he did not know." Olwen crossed the lodge and sat beside him on the bed. "That makes you more than an outsider." Zachary sat up, the furs pooling around his waist. "Your people have a right to be suspicious, and I have a right to choose who I care about." She reached out and touched his face, her fingers warm against his cheek. "I care about you, Zachary. I have since the second night in the cabin when you let me warm your feet and did not complain." "That is a low bar. It is higher than you think." She smiled, and he saw the tusks again, the small points that made her face seem fiercer and more beautiful all at once. "Stay, at least through the winter. Let my people see who you are. And if they do not like what they see, then they are fools and we will leave together." Zachary stared at her. "You would leave your clan? For the right person, yes. Olwen, I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other a short time. But I also know that I have never met anyone like you, and I do not want to lose you because I was too afraid to ask you to stay." Zachary took her hand and held it, feeling the calluses on her palm, the strength in her fingers. I will stay. Truly, truly. She kissed him then, properly this time, her mouth warm and soft and tasting faintly of honey. He kissed her back and felt the last of his resistance crumble. When they finally broke apart, she was smiling, and so was he. Good, she said. Because my grandmother has already adopted you, and if you leave, she will hunt you down and drag you back. Zachary laughed, and it felt like the first real laugh he had managed in years. The winter passed slowly, as winters did in the mountains. Zachary stayed in Olwen's lodge, and the clan gradually accepted him. Some, like Mara, welcomed him openly. Others, like Darren, tolerated him with thin civility. But he worked hard, helping with the hunting and the firewood and the endless small tasks that kept a camp running through the cold months. And eventually, even the skeptics began to nod to him when they passed. He learned the clan's ways, their songs, their stories, their method of smoking meat so it lasted through the deep snows. He taught them his trapping techniques, the best ways to set snares for winter hare, how to read tracks in fresh powder. He gave away his tools, his knowledge, his time, and asked for nothing in return. Olwen watched him with a look that he was beginning to recognize. She smiled more when he was near, laughed at his terrible jokes, found excuses to touch his hand or his shoulder. And at night, when they lay together under the firs, she fit against him the way she had in the cabin, and he wondered how he had ever been alone. In the deep heart of winter, when the snow was piled higher than a man's head and the cold was a living thing that clawed at the lodge walls, Mara called him to her fire. "Sit," she said, and he sat. She was smoking a pipe, the smoke curling up toward the roof vent, and she studied him through the haze. "You have been here 2 months now." "Yes. And in that time you have given my people everything you own, your traps, your tools, your food, your knowledge. Even your coin, which I know you gave to Garrett's wife so she could buy medicine for her son." Zachary said nothing. "You know what we call you?" Mara asked. "I have heard a few names. The young people call you Snow Brother. The old people call you Fool Who Gives. But I call you something else." She leaned forward, her eyes bright. "I call you family." Zachary felt his throat tighten. "Mara, you love my granddaughter." It was not a question, but he answered anyway. "Yes, and she loves you. I have known this for weeks, but she is too stubborn to say it first." Mara puffed her pipe, then set it aside. "I am giving you permission to marry her. By our law, the eldest of the family must approve all bonds. I approve. I have not asked her yet." "Then ask her, you fool. Before she decides you are too slow and asks you herself." Zachary laughed despite himself. "What if she says no?" "She will not say no. But if she does, you may come live with me and I will adopt you as my grandson. Then you will still be family, and Olwen will regret her choice for the rest of her life. That is surprisingly generous. I am a surprisingly generous woman." Mara picked up her pipe again. "Now go. I am tired of looking at your love-struck face." Zachary left the lodge and walked through the camp, his breath misting in the frigid air. He found Olwen at the edge of the clearing, skinning a deer that one of the hunters had brought in. Her hands were red with cold and blood, but she worked with steady efficiency. "Olwen," he said. She looked up and her face brightened. "Zachary, what is it?" "I need to ask you something." "Ask." He knelt in the snow beside her, suddenly nervous. "Your grandmother gave me permission to marry you." Olwen went very still. "Did she?" "Yes. But I wanted to ask you first, because it is your choice, not hers." He took a breath. "Will you marry me?" She stared at him, and for a terrible moment he thought she would say no. Then she dropped the knife and threw her arms around his neck, nearly knocking him over. "Yes," she said, and her voice was fierce. "Yes, you idiot, of course I will marry you." He held her, heedless of the blood on her hands, and felt something settle in his chest that he had not known was missing. She pulled back just far enough to kiss him, hard and joyful, and when they finally broke apart she was grinning. "We should tell my grandmother," she said. "She already knows." "Of course she does." Olwen laughed and kissed him again. When what? When do you want to marry?" Zachary thought about it. "As soon as possible." "Good, because I am not waiting until spring." They were married 3 days later in the center of the camp with the whole clan gathered to witness. It was not a human ceremony. There were no vows, no rings, no priest. Instead, Mara stood before them and asked if they chose each other, freely and without coercion. They both said yes. Then she tied their hands together with a braided cord and declared them bonded in the sight of the clan and the spirits of the mountain. It was simple and brief and perfect. That night they lay together in Olwen's lodge, now their lodge, and she traced the line of his jaw with her fingers. "Are you happy?" she asked. "Yes, truly, truly." She smiled and tucked herself against his chest. "Good, because you are stuck with me now. I can think of worse fates." "Liar." He laughed and kissed the top of her head. Outside the wind howled, but inside they were warm and together, and enough. The winter thawed slowly, the snow retreating up the mountainsides, and with the first signs of spring the clan began to prepare for the move to their summer grounds. Zachary helped with the packing, dismantling lodges and bundling supplies, and he felt a pang of regret. He had come to love the camp, the rhythm of the seasons, the sense of belonging, but Olwen had other plans. "I am not going with them," she said one evening as they sat by the fire. Zachary looked up surprised. "What? I am staying here with you." She poked the fire with a stick, not meeting his eyes. "The clan moves to follow the herds, but we do not need to. You are a hunter, I am a scout. We can make our own way. Your grandmother knows, I already told her." Olwen glanced at him. "She said I was making the right choice. She also said that if we do not visit her at least twice a year, she will come find us and drag us back by our ears." Zachary smiled despite himself. "That sounds like her. So we stay." He thought about it. A life here in the mountains with Olwen at his side. No more lonely trap lines, no more empty cabins. A home built from scratch with someone who chose him as surely as he had chosen her. "Yes," he said, "we stay." They chose a site for the cabin in the valley below the winter camp, near a creek that ran year-round, and a stand of tall pines that would provide timber. The clan helped them clear the ground before they left, felling trees and stripping logs, and Mara herself stayed an extra week to help raise the walls. "You build it strong," she told Zachary as she packed to leave. "Strong enough to hold my great-grandchildren. We will. And you take care of my girl. Always." Mara nodded, satisfied, and then she pulled him into a brief, fierce hug. "You are a good man, Zachary Frost. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise." Then she was gone, following the rest of the clan up the trail, and Zachary and Olwen were alone. They spent the summer building. Zachary cut and shaped the logs while Olwen chinked the gaps with mud and moss. They raised a roof, built a door, installed a proper stove that Zachary bought from a trader passing through. They dug a root cellar and filled it with sacks of grain and dried vegetables. They hunted and fished and foraged, laying in supplies for the next winter, and in the long evenings when the work was done, they sat together on the porch they had built and watched the sun set over the mountains. "You miss it?" Olwen asked one night. "Your old life?" "No. Not even a little," Zachary thought about it. "Sometimes I miss the quiet, but then I remember what the quiet felt like before I met you, and I do not miss it at all." She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "I am glad. Are you happy?" "Very." They sat in silence for a while, and then Olwen said, "I saw a trader in the village last week. He said there are blankets for sale. Good wool ones, thick and warm." "We should get 2, Zachary said, "so we are not fighting over one like we did in the cabin." Olwen laughed. "I was not fighting." You were hogging it. I was not. You were. Your feet are like ice and you kept shoving them against my legs. You told me to. I was being polite. You are never polite. She elbowed him gently and he caught her hand and held it. They sat like that until the stars came out, bright and sharp against the dark sky. The first snow came in late autumn, a dusting that melted by noon. But it was a warning, and Zachary spent the next 2 weeks cutting firewood. He stacked it against the cabin wall, a mountain of split logs that reached higher than his head, and when Olwen saw it she shook her head. "That is too much," she said. "It is enough for 2 people for an entire winter. It is enough for 4 people for an entire winter. Then we will have extra." She looked at him, her eyes soft. "You are thinking of the cabin. Yes, we will not run out this time, I know, but I want to be sure." She kissed him and he tasted snow on her lips. "You are a good man, Zachary Frost. You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." They went to the village 2 days later and bought blankets, 2 of them, thick and heavy and dyed a deep blue. Zachary carried them home while Olwen walked beside him, her hand in his, and when they reached the cabin she spread one on the bed and folded the other on the shelf. "There," she said. "Now we are prepared. For what? For winter. For whatever comes." She turned to him and her smile was mischievous, "And for any travelers who might need help." Zachary raised an eyebrow. "You want to give away one of the blankets, if someone needs it, yes. We just bought them, and we can afford to be generous. You taught me that." She crossed the room and wrapped her arms around his waist. "Besides, it is good practice." "For what?" "For when we have children. They will need to learn to share." Zachary went very still. "Children, eventually, if you want them." "I do." "Good." She rested her head against his chest. "Then we will need the extra firewood after all." He laughed and held her close, and outside the first real snow began to fall. The winter was long but gentle. They stayed warm, ate well, and spent the dark evenings telling stories or playing dice games that Olwen always won. Twice they made the trek to the winter camp to visit Mara, who fed them until they could barely move and sent them home with bundles of food and sharp instructions to take care of themselves. And in the spring, when the snow melted and the creek ran high and fast, a traveler appeared at their door. A young man, thin and ragged, who had gotten lost in the mountains and run out of supplies. Zachary and Olwen fed him, let him rest for 2 days, and when he left they gave him one of the blue blankets. "You did not have to do that," the man said, his eyes bright with gratitude. "We know," Olwen said, "but someone did it for us once and we are passing it along." The man thanked them again, and then he was gone, and Zachary and Olwen stood on the porch and watched him disappear down the trail. "We will need to buy another blanket," Zachary said. "I know. For the next person." "Yes." He took her hand and she laced her fingers through his. The sun was warm on their faces, and the valley was green and alive, and the cabin behind them was sturdy and strong and full of everything they needed. "I love you," he said. "I love you too." And that, in the end, was enough.